North Idaho College, in cooperation with KSPS TV, presents Earth in Crisis, A Search for Solutions. Highlights from the 38th Annual NIC Popcorn Forum. The 2008 symposium featured guest lectures and public discussion on 5 critical issues facing the world today. This is Episode 4, The Threat of Domestic and International Terrorism.
Welcome to the 4th of our 5 one-hour documentaries addressing Earth in Crisis, A Search for Solutions. On today's documentary, our topic is the growing threat of domestic and international terrorism. This documentary will feature 2 outstanding experts. First of all is Dr. Jeffrey Simon, who is a great expert on terrorism and is also the author of a critically acclaimed book titled The Terrorist Trap, America's Experience with Terrorism. The second guest on this documentary you will see is Colonel Philip P.J. Crawley. He is the Senior Fellow and Director of Homeland Security at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. He served 28 years in the Air Force and was a high-ranking official in the United States Department of Defense, and during part of the Clinton administration, he was a senior director of public affairs for the National Security Council. They will be joined by a number of panelists who are also experts in the field. I hope you find this documentary most informative.
We conferred on terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, a capability that they have not yet demonstrated. We assumed that if they could do what they did on 9/11, if they could hijack 4 airplanes and fly them with some sophistication into the World Trade Center towers, into the Pentagon, and presumably into the Capitol building, that they were capable of almost anything. I think we need to challenge that assumption, but that is the connection that has created this frame called the war on terror and has greatly influenced our policies and our actions, since 9/11. But in the current situation, we are not winning. We are not losing. The problem with that frame, of course, is that for a terrorist, you win by not losing. So the longer this goes on and the longer that we call it a war, the more we are, in fact, not only carrying on, in my mind, a strategy that is unsustainable, but one that is ultimately counterproductive. So it is a good time here at the 7-year point and at the point of presidential transition to think about where we are and where we need to go and put terrorism in its proper context. This year, the war on terror will cost us roughly $180 billion. And there are opportunity costs associated with that expense. So I think one of the challenges is not only what to do about these things, but also understand that by choosing a strategy of a certain dimension, you are giving up the opportunity or you're giving up the resources that could help build other tools that will be equally, if not more, decisive in combating terrorism over the long run. In doing that strategic reassessment, we have to go back and answer or re-answer many of these questions, determine who actually is the enemy. And part of the problem in Washington, where I have spent most of the last 25 years, is we've reduced strategy down to a 30-second soundbite. Or we say we're fighting a single adversary. And in doing so, we lump a lot of the disparate elements that Jeff was mentioning into a single basket without realizing that there is a profound difference between Al-Qaeda on the one hand and what it's trying to do and what it's capable of doing. Hezbollah in Lebanon on the other hand, Hamas in the Palestinian territories, even Jamaah Islamiyah in Indonesia, or in Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines. We have to think about the difference between a network that is not affiliated or not being supported directly by a country, and a country like Iran, which does in fact is the preeminent state sponsor of terrorism even today. We have to determine, what is actually at risk. What we want government to keep us as safe as possible. Who is responsible for doing that? I happen to be one who believes that one of the great assets that we have at our disposal, and one of the most decisive aspects in preventing terrorism in the future, is the policeman on the beat. Because chances are, in our country, the next person that's going to come across a terrorism event, or at least a terrorism plot, is likely to be the local policeman or the local private security guard, not necessarily an intelligence analyst in Washington. But what I worry about is that we see a gap emerging between the expectations that we as Americans have for keeping the country safe and the capabilities that exist at the federal level, at the state and local level, and in the private sector to actually do what needs to be done. And so these will in fact feed into what I will identify as at least 3 lessons for the future. Jeff covered a lot of this territory. I will go through it rather quickly. I'm not fond of the war on terror frame because I think that ultimately we have to separate out individually who are these groups that potentially threaten the United States or our interests, how are they likely to function, and who actually has the capability to attack the United States. And I focus first and foremost on Al-Qaeda, but it has evolved in very significant ways that we have to understand and adapt our strategy appropriately. First and foremost, obviously, is the core group that now has a safe haven in the tribal areas between Pakistan and Afghanistan. If you haven't heard the term FATA, federally administered tribal areas, you probably will. That is presumably the location currently of Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and the core elements of what was Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. They are certainly less capable than they were 7 years ago. They are, among other things, a source of inspiration. Bin Laden and Zawahiri issue frequent radio and television video tapes inspiring people to take action based on world events. Most importantly, the most important development, I think, since beyond just the Al-Qaeda Central is the increasing affiliation of regional terrorism groups with the Al-Qaeda brand, if you will. It's fashionable in jihadist circles today to be identified with Al-Qaeda. Certainly the Iraq situation has helped promote that popularity. So you worry about groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And thankfully, we have a strategy that appears to bearing fruit in terms of isolating, the terrorists who are in Iraq. You also worry about a group like that's now called the Islamic movement Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. Used to be a separate group, distinct group that was focused in Algeria. But the real question here and the challenge for us is, while they were always focused on local grievances, to the extent that they shift and not only have a local focus, but a regional or international focus, these groups could turn their attention from what they've always focused on, what's called the near enemy, to what they might focus on in the future, the far enemy, which would be the United States. There is a fascinating new book that I highly recommend to everyone. Mark Sageman, who is a former CIA analyst, has written a book called Leaderless Jihad. He describes what he calls the third generation of the evolution of the current jihadist threat. And these are newly radicalized, but primarily independent actors. Now, I think we can assess at this point, in my mind, that the primary threat of terrorism for us today remains outside the United States. And this has very significant implications. If it's outside the United States, it means that they're going to have to, cross our borders, as the 9/11 hijackers did. They're going to have to acquire some capability once they get in the country, and they're going to have to be able to plot, execute a plot without being discovered. Clearly, based on what we've done over the past 7 years, this is far more difficult to do. If I was advising the next president, I said, okay, where do you need to spend most of your attention? And obviously, one country that's not on here is Iran. And that is important, but for perhaps slightly different reasons. But to me, the most significant country in terms of the future or the immediate to midterm risk of terrorism to the United States is Pakistan. Europe, in fact, has today a very significant and serious homegrown threat. The center of gravity in terms of this informal movement among the diaspora from the Islamic world is centered in countries like Great Britain. And depending on their ability to handle terrorism within their borders, that will have a significant impact in terms of the potential that something happening there can directly affect us here in the United States. Containment and deterrence actually worked during the Cold War, and they apply directly to the threat of terrorism. We have to go negative on al-Qaeda. We have to say to moderates within the Islamic world, what they're primarily doing is hurting your own. We have to discredit the religious veneer that they use to justify their actions. We have to delegitimize violence as a weapon.
Now, the reason terrorism has endured over time can be seen in its unique characteristics. What separates terrorism from all other kinds of conflicts is the ability of a single incident to throw a nation into crisis and have repercussions far beyond the original event. The events of September 11th, 2001 illustrated this beyond any doubt. When you think about it, less than 20 terrorists were able to accomplish in just a couple of hours of violence what the former Soviet Union and other U.S. adversaries throughout history were never, ever able to do, namely make virtually every American feel vulnerable to violent attack and create incredible fear and despair throughout the country. Terrorism is not a war in the traditional meaning of the word. We don't always know who the enemies are or where they may be planning their next attack. In terrorism, it is the type of incident and its impact upon society and government that counts, not the frequency of incidents. Terrorist incidents have become more lethal in recent years, with several attacks causing large numbers of casualties. One manifestation of this emergence of smarter terrorists, of course, is cyber terrorism, which we've heard a lot about. Terrorists can use the internet and other communication and information systems that are linked by computers to cause disruptions and chaos in government, business, and our everyday life. Among the scenarios we hear about are terrorists sabotaging air traffic control systems and thereby causing airplane crashes, sabotaging electric power systems, thereby causing power blackouts, or sending computer viruses around the world that will cause disruption or even collapse of the international financial and banking system. Terrorists can also use the internet, however, to acquire valuable information on potential targets, including diagrams and maps of airports and buildings, flight and train schedules, and even computer images of the inside of a plane indicating how many passengers will be on that flight and the exact location of available seats. All this vital information for any terrorist planning a hijacking or a suicide mission. Terrorists also use the internet to communicate freely with each other through encrypted messages, either through emails or postings on various web pages. A third trend that we're seeing, of course, is the rise of religious terrorism, a shift away from political and ideological terrorism to terrorism that's related more to religious causes. One of the key differences between religious-inspired terrorism and politically motivated terrorism is that religious-inspired terrorists have fewer constraints in their mind about killing large numbers of people. All non-believers are viewed as the enemy, and the religious terrorists are less concerned than the political terrorists about possible backlashes from their supporters if they kill a large number of innocent people. Now, the most ominous threat, the most ominous trend that I see, and more than any justifies calling the period we're living in now the new age of terrorism, is the growing threat of terrorists using weapons of mass destruction, which are chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. Regardless of what happens in Iraq and Afghanistan, the war on terrorism is going to continue around the world. This is because the United States, by virtue of its superpower status and its policies that can sometimes alienate and anger other populations, is always going to be a target, both at home and abroad, for a diverse array of terrorists. It's also important to counter the message of all terrorists. Terrorists can exploit various issues that are important in a society and they also can fuel the flames of hatred and intolerance. Particularly in the case of Islamic extremist violence, it's important to discredit the legitimacy of the religious violence. But this needs to be done from within the religious communities. The more that moderate elements in a religious movement can be persuaded to denounce the violence and demonstrate how the terrorist attacks go against the teachings of the holy books, the less legitimate the religious terrorist may appear in the society. The more we think like a terrorist, the better chances we have of anticipating their behavior. Now, one of the more innovative counter-terrorist policies that we are now pursuing is having cultural anthropologists accompany U.S. troops on missions to villages in Iraq and Afghanistan. These anthropologists are part of what is known as human terrain teams. They help us to understand the cultural, social, tribal, religious, and other factors that can affect the situation of foreign conflict environments such as Iraq and Afghanistan. Another innovative program that we're using to combat terrorism and insurgency in Iraq is known as the Awakening Councils, or Concerned Local Citizens. These are mostly Sunni tribal groups that we've persuaded, mainly through payments of money, to turn against al-Qaeda and other extremists. Some of the members of the Awakening Councils are believed to be former militants themselves, and others former sympathizers of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now, in terms of the concrete measures that we are pursuing in the battle against terrorism, the most important and the one for which we've had the most success with involves intelligence and law enforcement. The failure by our intelligence agencies to connect all the dots in the months preceding 9/11, actions that may have led to the identity and arrest of some of the hijackers, and possibly the prevention of the attacks, has obscured the fact that good intelligence and law enforcement has prevented many major terrorist attacks from occurring in the past. Yet by learning how to live with terrorism and at the same time improving our readiness to anticipate and respond to this new age of terrorism, many lives can be saved and the terrorists deny their goal of creating panic, fear, and crisis throughout the world.
We have been, as an agency, preventing terrorism for years. So, this is not anything new. My introduction to terrorism really in the FBI started on September 12th. I was working on a drug task force in our earlier series of We Have the War on Terror, and at the height of the war on drugs, I was involved in that. And there were some very good observations about use of that term and what that all implies. For us in law enforcement, being part of something labeled a war in some sense is positive, because what comes with that are necessary tools, additional funding, training opportunities. It bumps you up a little bit in the priority, but that obviously that war changed. And I was struck when right on September 12th, when I was working in San Diego on a drug task force. We obviously were addressing a multitude of terrorism leads that very next day. We came to find out very shortly thereafter that two 9/11 hijackers were actually living within 1 mile of the FBI office in San Diego, and were renting a room from somebody who at one point had been an FBI informant. Needless to say, that got our attention, and we're starting to put a lot of agents out on the streets to, typically what we do on these things is an exact timeline. How long did these people live in San Diego? Our ultimate goal at that time was that entire time that they were in our territory, I want to know where they put their head every night. I want to know who they talked to. And our key goal at that time, and it was a frantic time for us, even as far away from New York City as you can imagine, but even in San Diego, are we going to get hit again? And that was what was running through everybody's thought, and that's how we geared ourselves. So the instant reaction from management there in San Diego was, we've got 5 drug squads of about 20 agents. Guess what? Poof, you guys are terrorism squads now. And what really struck me as a drug agent, coming out of the #1 criminal priority in our agency and in our office at that time, was the drug war with Mexico. Southwest border was the front line of the drug war in this country at that time. And we had all the resources, we had all the legal tools. I stepped over in that very next day and started working terrorism, and I was shocked at the tools we did not have on the terrorism side. For example, and actually this discrepancy even exists today. just to do something simple as obtain phone records from a drug dealer. On a drug side, I have authority as an FBI field supervisor by my signature to sign an administrative subpoena and get transactional phone records. There's very strict statutory limits on the types of records I can obtain, but something very simple as I want to look at 30 days worth of cell phone records from a suspected drug dealer. I can sign a legally binding subpoena, serve that on a phone company, and get that. Now, there's an audit trail, and there's a lot of compliance issues we need to do to make sure that that authority isn't abused, but I can get the records quickly. September 12th, when I stepped over and started working, the number one priority in the nation at that time, we were operating under a procedure where if I wanted to get 30 days worth of phone records from a suspected terrorist or an associate of one of these 9/11 hijackers, it was going to take me upwards of 30 to 60 days.
Well, Colonel Crawley, thank you for sitting down and having this brief conversation. We enjoyed your presentation at North Idaho College, and you are a very enlightened person on a very, very serious problem we were here to discuss today, and in this conversation, understanding terrorism and terrorists. And so I want to take advantage of this time to ask you some questions. In dealing with international terrorism, which has been of great concern after 9/11, where should we put our greatest efforts today in trying to address terrorism in other countries of the world?
Well, it's not one thing, it's a collection of things. I mean, first and foremost, we have to do whatever we can to prevent terrorism attacks inside the United States. But we also have to shape the international environment so that we see, to the extent that we can, a lowering in conflict and extremism and hatred that manifests itself in terrorism. So it's not one thing, it's a number of things. It's not one instrument like defeating terrorists militarily, although sometimes we'll have to do that. It is also having better intelligence, international cooperation, effective law enforcement. But it's also trying to isolate the extremists by reducing the community support that they enjoy overseas that legitimizes terrorism against the United States and against innocent civilians.
Dr. Simon, who's on this documentary as well as you, indicated the same thing, is that it's a very different type of campaign than a war against the nation states. So based upon that, what else do we need to do that is in some real specifics? For example, where we concentrate our budget in relation to this issue. And I heard you also say that it's not only dealing with combating the violence itself, which is very important to do for safety, but also there is a diplomatic part to this process.
Well, nation states do matter. I mean, obviously, yes. One of the things that you have to prevent is the development of a safe haven that can give terrorists time and space to be able to plot and then carry out attacks. Obviously, we knew they had a safe haven in Afghanistan in the 90s. We tried to intercept that, and we were unsuccessful. But now one of our objectives in Iraq, even though in my view we should reduce our commitment to Iraq so that we do have resources that can be applied in other areas, we have to make sure that first and foremost, whatever residual capability al-Qaeda may have in Iraq does not remain and does not harm us at some point in the future. But certainly, while we have relied most significantly on our military instrument over the course of 7 years, in a war of necessity, as I see it, in Afghanistan, a war of choice, as I see it, in Iraq, we have to recognize that there is an opportunity cost to the $15 billion a month that we devote to the current strategy. It does necessarily mean that we are not able to have more effective non-military tools of intervention to be able to lower the threat of extremism overseas. We've lost legitimacy in the eyes of the rest of the world. It also means that we're not building up our defenses here in the United States to combat not just terrorism, but a range of challenges that we may face in the future.
If we continue for a number of more years with a very large personnel in Iraq and very much funding, is it possible by that concentration and having limited resources that we could lose in both Afghanistan and Pakistan? Could they reestablish themselves as a major force and a dangerous force?
There's no question in my mind that our shift in emphasis from Afghanistan in 2002 to Iraq in 2003 has been very costly in a number of ways. First, it took the pressure off Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. They have been able to reestablish a safe haven in something called the Fatah, the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. If there is an attack against the United States sometime in the near future, it's my judgment that there will be a link to Pakistan, not a link to Iraq. But the invasion into Iraq in 2003 against Saddam Hussein, who was clearly a problem for the United States, but he had no meaningful link to Al-Qaeda. It opened the door for Al-Qaeda to actually establish a presence in Iraq. And today, even still, even though we have been successful in reducing the impact that Al-Qaeda has within Iraq, our presence in Iraq is still a magnet. It actually is a net increase. There was a 2003 memo from the Secretary of Defense at that time, Donald Rumsfeld, where he posed the question, is our strategy actually creating more terrorists than we were able to eliminate? And my judgment is today, while we are in a better situation than we say were a year or two ago, still our over-reliance on the military component actually means that we're increasing the level of violence, the level of extremism and terrorism in the world, and that increases the threat to the United States.
As we're taping this program in March 2008, or having this conversation at this time, things may change some before we actually air this documentary, but there's just been elections in Pakistan, and certainly the incumbent government was not supported in those elections. And if we have a major change in the government in Pakistan, it could also be moving more towards a democracy, or of course it could go in the other direction. Are we in a position and a risk that there could be a takeover in Pakistan, and with nuclear weapons, that would be far more serious than what we've been concerned about in Iraq?
As I look at the international environment, to me, the single most significant country of concern when it comes to terrorism and the terrorism threat to the United States is Pakistan, not Iraq. And Pakistan obviously is connected to Afghanistan. You have a situation where the core elements of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, others, are now in a veritable safe haven in the federally administered tribal areas. They have been able to join forces with other elements within Pakistan that are trying to destabilize the government in Pakistan. Obviously, we saw the tragic assassination of Benazir Bhutto in December as a manifestation of that. In this particular case, in my view, while President Musharraf early on in this decade was a stabilizing influence in Pakistan, he now is a very destabilizing, perceived as an authoritarian leader. And so his unpopularity is also feeding increased anti-Americanism in Pakistan. We need to support effective government institutions in Pakistan. And one of them would be a parliament, and there's a new opportunity here with under remarkable circumstances, an election that may not have been perfect, but certainly is viewed as legitimate in the eyes of the Pakistani people. You will have a new prime minister, you have a new speaker of the parliament who's a woman, but the major question for the new parliament is what to do about the Supreme Court. And we have to, if we're supporting democracy around the world and good government around the world, we have to back institutions in these pivotal countries, not personalities. So while President Musharraf has been somewhat beneficial to the United States, I think in the long run we have to shift back. And this we have to try to do gradually in other countries as well, because part of the terrorist narrative is that we, the United States, are supporting these despotic leaders in various parts of the world. We have to, try to do our best to increase the opportunity, the ability to have political expression within these societies. That's one of those mechanisms to reduce extremism around the world.
With your great expertise, I will give you a scenario. Let us suppose that Iran continues towards development of nuclear weapons in Iran, and then there's a drastic change in the Pakistani government, and there's a uniting of the Al-Qaeda forces in Pakistan, and we have to deal with those two problems at the same time. How are we going to proceed with that? What kind of pitfalls would lie ahead?
Well, the fact is the next president is going to have to deal with Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iran as probably the most significant and complex issues that the next president will face. Part of our challenge has been determining who actually is the adversary. We created this war on terror. I think it's too broad a frame. There are terrorists, there are security concerns in each of these countries, but we have to have policies that are effective for each one. And in the case of Iran, Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism, no question about it. Iran has nuclear ambitions. They are developing the capability to produce a nuclear weapon. I don't think they've made the strategic decision to move to actually building that weapon, and we should do everything in our power to try to prevent that from happening. If Iran becomes a demonstrated nuclear power, it will have an effect in the Middle East, moving Saudi Arabia in that direction, Egypt in that direction, others in that direction. That actually would increase the potential that there'll be this nuclear nightmare, that you'll have more technology that could, in fact, move into the hands of a terrorist group. But the key for the United States is, if you're going to convince Iran to move in a more constructive direction vis-a-vis Iraq, vis-a-vis support of terrorism, moderate their nuclear ambitions, we, the United States, have to ultimately have a direct conversation with them, starting at a working level and working up to a higher level, perhaps even a presidential level, at an appropriate time. But the only way we're going to resolve these range of security concerns with Iran is to have the same kind of dialogue with Iran that we effectively had during the Cold War with the Soviet Union.
Would you agree with the late President Kennedy's statement is that we should not fear to negotiate. We shouldn't, be doing our activities based on fear, but we should not fear to negotiate.
There is a psychology in Washington that negotiation means appeasement, and it really doesn't. It means, in fact, you're using the most effective way of resolving conflict short of war. And we've obviously seen in Iraq that there's a tremendous cost when we are forced to or choose to use the military as the primary instrument to effect change overseas. We have critical issues with Iran. They have to be resolved, but we have to go the extra mile, particularly where we have lost legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. We have to make sure that before we have to resort to some other option, we have done everything in our power, working as our own country and working in concert with the region and with the United Nations, try to do everything we can to resolve these situations short of war.
And in the Islamic world, we know that in both Iran and in Iraq, that the majority of the people are Shiites. The Sunnis are about 20%, I guess, in Iraq. But in some of the other countries, the overwhelming majority are Sunnis. In your studies, in that friction between the Sunnis and Shiites, particularly in Iraq, the terrorists, are they more inclined to emerge from one of those factions than the other one?
Well, in fact, there are Sunni terrorist groups, there are Shia terrorist groups, and we tend to lump them all into one basket and treat them as one enemy, and they're not. The fact is, Al-Qaeda, a Sunni Arab dominated group, poses one set of challenge. Hezbollah in Lebanon, a Shia group, poses a different challenge. Iran has an emerging relationship with Hamas in the Palestinian territories that is very problematic. But then in Asia, you have groups that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, Jamaat Islamiyah in Indonesia. But each of these groups is motivated. They may operate under an umbrella for convenience sake, but each of them poses a different challenge to the United States. We have to have policies that are focused on breaking down these groups, understanding what motivates each one, understanding how you might work effectively with these governments, whether it's Indonesia, the Philippines, Iraq, Lebanon, Israel, others, to try to diminish this threat that we face. We can't afford to lump them all into one basket. By the same token, it's one thing for a terrorist like bin Laden to say, I want to establish a caliphate across the Islamic world. But when you start to break this down and look at just what's happening in Iraq, this is hard to do. And we actually give him increased legitimacy when we take that at face value. So I think going forward, we have to be very mindful. This is a very serious threat that we face. But Al-Qaeda today or terrorists today, they're not the Soviet Union. It is my view that 19 terrorists or however many might be involved in a future plot, they cannot change our way of life. They do not threaten our way of life. But what is crucial to a terrorist is not the attack itself, which is very manageable in most circumstances. It is our response to the attack. And terrorists always bank on their opponent overreacting. And when we do that the wrong way, we actually support their narrative, we create opportunities for them, and we increase their support and their danger. So in the future, in managing this challenge, we have to do things in the right reason for the right way, and by doing that, we can hopefully contain and deter terrorism in the future.
That reminds me of the late Franklin D. Roosevelt when he said in one of his speeches that you have nothing to fear but fear itself, and I think he got that from someone else, but is that what you're speaking to?
Certainly, and to say that we are probably going to be attacked again is not to succumb to fear or the politics of fear. Quite the opposite. It is to create in our own minds that this is something that episodically, that periodically, we are going to encounter. Terrorism is politics by another means. Today we're worried about the economy. This would be like Ben Bernanke saying, I'm going to eliminate a recession. It's one thing to think about it, but you can't change the economic cycle. So we will always face terrorism, which is the only weapon that an inferior opponent has to challenge a superior opponent. But what we can do is make sure that it is properly contained. And this requires us to work more effectively and collaboratively around the world to isolate the terrorists rather than isolating ourselves.
I think you have a great balance. You come from a long military background, and you understand the military and the defense and the Pentagon. But you also are very steeped in diplomatic processes, and I see that in you. My question is that oftentimes our government is criticized throughout the years that we are not sophisticated enough in understanding other cultures, and that's why we make some of these mistakes that we make, particularly in the Middle East. How would you respond to that?
This is a conundrum. I think that part of our strength as a nation is that we're not encumbered by history. Recently you had attacks by angry Serbs against our embassy over the independence of Kosovo. They are captives to a history that goes back 700 years. So we are not inhibited by that. We are a relatively new country, even still. And that is actually part of our strength. We think as a country that all things are possible, and that feeds a sense of innovation. But the other end of the spectrum is also true. We tend to discount the importance of history. And we tend to we fail to understand countries like Afghanistan or countries like Iraq before we actually try to occupy them. So I think going forward we have to understand and see the world not only how we see it, but try to appreciate how we are viewed by others around the world. And that takes a far more capable and more broad-based national security policy than we are following today. If you ask a politician, they want to say, I want to be strong on national security, they're going to give the next dollar to the Pentagon. And I'm not against making sure that we have the most effective military that we can possibly have. But we have to make sure that we are cultivating all of the instruments of national power so that we have an effective State Department that can intervene through non-military means. We are properly promoting economic opportunity and development. We are mindful of the fact that infectious disease can create conflict in a society every bit as much as an occupying army can. So, the world is smaller than it was, and we are no longer immune from these range of challenges because we are blessed to have, two oceans on each side and two peaceful neighbors in north and south. But we are going to face challenges in the future, whether it's war on the one hand, terrorism, it could be infectious disease, it could be more storms, more deadly storms fueled by global warming. These all have to be seen in a security prism, and then we have to make sure that we are investing properly across a balanced strategy so that we are as prepared as we can be for whatever comes our way.
I have a statement to get you to react to. We appear to be in somewhat of a quagmire in the Middle East right now with the difficulties. And based upon that, and have we learned from this, and are you optimistic about the future?
The next president will face a real challenge, and these are all issues that are very complex. They don't lend themselves to simple solutions. Right. What has always been true is the United States has always been perceived as a beacon of hope and the honest broker around the world, and particularly in the Middle East. We have to find ways to resume that level of engagement and that sense of trust and confidence that we can try as best as we can, even though the ultimate solutions rest not with the United States imposing a solution, but with governments like Israel, people like the Palestinians, governments like Iran, movements like Hezbollah. They have to be convinced of where their long-term interest is. We can have a role in that, but first and foremost, we have to reestablish our legitimacy, reduce the level of anti-Americanism, reestablish common cause with the rest of the world. This is not appeasing the world. This is not capitulating in terms of our national interests. This is being smart about using our power as intelligently as possible.
Colonel Crawley, thank you for sitting down for this conversation.
Tony,
Appreciate
a pleasure
it.
very much.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Simon, we really enjoyed your presentation today, and it's part of our documentary that we're going to be doing, but I just want to sit down and have a conversation with you in some more detail. And when you talked today about combating terrorism, what works and what doesn't in the new age of terrorism, it was very, very helpful and most informative. One of the things that you talked about that I want to elaborate on with you in this conversation is that political leaders of both parties, and they obviously mean very well, but they say we have a war on terrorism, and obviously you are, like they, trying to do all we can to combat the terrorism, but why can it be misleading to call it a war?
Well, the main reason is, one, it raises expectations for the public and for others about some ultimate endgame, some solution, some victory. But terrorists and the threat of terrorism is not a monolithic enemy. We have all types of different terrorists, and as soon as you think you may have won this quote-unquote war on terrorism, the next day somebody else could set off a bomb somewhere, and then you're basically back down to zero in terms of perceptions on fighting terrorism. And the concept of war on terrorism is not new to the current administration. It was used in the 1980s during the Reagan years, and in fact, in 1920, we had in the United States a number of terrorist attacks, and authorities then was calling it a war. So there's this temptation to try to use that terminology because I think it allows for some vision of an armed force being able to prove victorious, and yet it really unfortunately plays into the terrorist hands because they want to be at war with a superpower.
It is much more global as far as our concern than it used to be. And of course, after 9/11, we realized how detrimental it can be, how horrific it can be. But in the past, if you look at the war in Vietnam or the Korean War, World War II or I, we had a very direct nation-state conflict. And at some point, there was victory and surrender by, like in World War II, Italy and Germany and Japan. With these sales around the world and no particular specific target, does that give you also concern or pessimism that it will be ongoing and it's not like a country surrendering?
Absolutely. That's why, like, the threat of state-sponsored terrorism is more manageable in terms of devising policies. You go after state-sponsored terrorism with a bunch of different options, whether it be military options, economic, financial, but with decentralized terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, and not just the religious extremists. There's other political, ideological, ethnic nationalists, and even the single issue and lone operator type of terrorists. It becomes very difficult to try to look at them as a single enemy for which you can design policies that are going to result in a solution.
With all that happened in 9/11, and it was so horrific, as I've already indicated, and we obviously responded by making some change in our country and our structure of investigations. But one of the concerns that I have, or I think of concerning that, we hear a lot about copycat crimes. And so internally, where most of these crimes like 9/11 came from people outside the country, should we have an enhanced concern about individuals in this country? They're not tied to that particular groups of people like Al-Qaeda, but just decide on their own as loners they would turn to crime.
Definitely. We have to realize before 9/11, the Oklahoma City bombing was the worst terrorist attack ever on U.S. soil. And actually, in 1920, we had a Wall Street bombing that was done by domestic terrorists. So that the threat remains in terms of people can get ideas from internet, from what they read about in the news, etc. So the copycat threat remains. And basically, we're in this information society, a global village, And, as we speak right now, unfortunately, terrorists are thinking up all over the world new ways of perpetrating their violence.
In relation to that, as it is globally and around the world, what changes have we made, or what changes should we make to try to have greater intelligence? Certainly, there was some intelligence that we had available, but unfortunately the agencies had not been talking to one another, and that probably could have been prevented. Are we making changes?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, there is more cooperation now between different law enforcement and intelligence personnel. They're trying to manage the whole question of the information, but that still is a problem because you get so much data coming in, you have so much intelligence that it becomes an issue. How do you sort out what's relevant from what may be misleading or just totally irrelevant? And you don't want to waste time tracking down wrong leads. So that's still something we have to work on in terms of being able to sift through all the different kinds of information. But I think also, in terms of 9/11, we probably should realize that even if that had been prevented, something else would have occurred. Al-Qaeda was determined to strike on U.S. soil. They were determined to show that we were vulnerable. And so if for some reason we had gotten wind of 9/11 and prevented it, it only would have delayed a further attack. So somewhere down the road, they still would have hit our homeland, unfortunately.
Some of our experts, and certainly we consider you one, and we will have on this program also Colonel Crawley, who worked for the President of the United States and also worked in the Defense Department. In some of your presentations, you've indicated that Al-Qaeda in particular, and other groups, they're very patient. So should Americans be very aware that even though we may have a long period of time, unfortunately it's been 7 years without another major attack in the United States, but we shouldn't take that as an idea that it won't happen again. Aren't they very methodical and very patient between their attacks?
I mean, they have time on their side. They can attack whatever target they want, whenever they want, and it doesn't have to be at an occasion that we're expecting a high-profile event. I mean, September 11th was an insignificant date in terms of historical purposes for terrorism, and they just struck that date, and now that's the date we always talk about. But what our experience with terrorism has been these major attacks spread out over years. So it can happen at any time. But the one piece, I think, of good news that we have in the United States in terms of the terrorist threat is that once a major attack occurs, we can clamp down a lot of security, a lot of intelligence, a lot of law enforcement. People are aware that happened after 9/11. So I don't see our country as ever experiencing sustained terrorist campaigns where you have attack after attack as some countries in Europe and the Middle East and other areas have had. But we definitely will, unfortunately, have major attacks sporadically because we just can't protect every single target.
There's thousands and thousands of targets.
Definitely.
But I would assume our intelligence agencies and all are aware that some targets are more likely than others or would be more catastrophic.
Yeah, but except the Oklahoma City bombing threw that theory out because we always were expecting, well, it's going to be New York, it will be Washington, it could be Los Angeles. And we still can make risk assessments of what's more probable. But then when the federal building in Oklahoma City is blown up by an American-born terrorist, it just demonstrates how even the best laid plans can go to waste in terms of trying to predict that they're going to strike in this environment but not in the other environment.
In the 1980s, we had probably the most serious domestic terrorist group ever here in the Inland Northwest, and it was called Order 1, and there was Order 2, and there were a lot of crimes, and Order 2 did bombings, and the others there were murder and bank robberies, etc. One thing we learned from that, and fortunately they were caught and they were put away, but one of the things that people here learned about that particular type of domestic terrorism is that one of their techniques is to create fear in individuals. That in this case here, fortunately, the bombings, no one died, but it created within the society fear, and it's a way of trying to intimidate society. So what advice do you have to the public about either domestic or international terrorism if this is part of their strategy?
We can't live in fear of terrorism. And I know it's easy to say and hard to do, but the realities of the world in the 21st century and even the previous century was that there are a lot of people, groups out there who have evil intentions. They want to spread this fear, and they have the ability to be able to cause loss of life. But we have to try to raise our awareness level and try to do everything we can, relentless campaigns to shut them down, but also not allow every threat and every intimidating act force us into a mentality that the terrorists have won. Because once we change the way we live permanently in terms of caving into terrorism, or once we're living in fear day and night, then the terrorists really get what they want.
They get what they want without even more death and violence.
That's also when they can make a threat that has no credence at all. It can cause a lot of disruption. So they have a lot of options on their hand.
There's been a lot of discussion, Dave, between politically motivated terrorism and religious terrorism. And I want to address the second one with you. Yeah, it's very clear that in the Islamic world, the jihad and others that have been, I should say, Al-Qaeda and others, they're a very small portion of that particular world. The overwhelming majority of people are peace-loving, and they are moderates in the Islamic world. What can we do to communicate better with that very vast moderate world to get them to take charge and be able to control the very small group of extremists?
Definitely. The message has to come from within the moderates in the religious communities. And the more that they will denounce the violence and be able to show how the violence goes against the teachings of the holy books, that may be one way of denying the extremists, legitimacy. So definitely, and we have this already, ongoing dialogue and seeking out who the moderates are and being able to work with them and also address whatever issues they feel are needed to be talked about, and be able to show that, we are on their side in terms of trying to stem the violence and things along those lines, but not to allow basically the extremists to hijack the religion, which is what they have done.
Many people talk about that poverty recruits a group of people, or it's from poverty that the result is that often extremists come forth. But there are a lot of data that a lot of the people that are in Al-Qaeda now really came from quite wealthy families. So it's not all about poverty, is it?
No, it's a mixture now. The pilots on the 9/11 attacks came from middle class and even wealthy families, and they were older. And based on that, people were starting to say, well, maybe we have to reassess our image of the suicide attacker. But the muscle hijackers on the plane were basically uneducated and poor. These were the ones who were supposed to storm the cockpit in case there was any kind of trouble. And there's just been a recent report that's come out showing that a lot of the suicide terrorists in Iraq are coming from large families. They're uneducated, they're poor. But the problem with the suicide terrorists is that if they're believing they're rewarded in the afterlife, then it's really hard to deter them. And the fact that their characteristics now go from both young to older, poor to richer, shows that we're not going to be able to have a single profile of the suicide terrorists.
Some writers in this field have a theory that, there are so many theories and philosophies, but that some of the extremists in their hatred of the United States and the attacks on the United States, that there's a psychological factor here, that they have a resistance and a also disappointment that maybe their culture and society from a materialistic viewpoint has not been as successful. Is that a factor in this process for some of the individuals?
For some definitely. The factor that they say there is humiliation, they felt alienation, but it also goes back to the whole question about the concept of war on terrorism. We're always still trying to view this terrorism problem in sort of the black and white terms, monolithic enemy, just like with the Soviet Union, that we had a single enemy to look at, and you can be able to make all these projections. Not so with terrorism, so that while there are some who join the groups because of alienation, some out of humiliation, some out of poverty, some also out of being brainwashed, and some out of just reasons to change their everyday life. So there isn't a single reason for why somebody becomes a terrorist, because there's no one single terrorist.
Well, that's a really important point. So it's not a simple process, it's very complex, and it may require different strategies in different situations.
Yeah, and the reason we keep going back to trying to come up with these answers is that we're still trying to come up with policy. So, even the question of a policy on terrorism, well, what exactly does that mean? Is the policy on terrorism aimed at Islamic extremists, or is the policy on terrorism aimed at the potential threat of state-sponsored terrorists making a resurgence? Is it dealing with political ideological terrorism? So it becomes very, very confusing for the public and even for those who are making the pronouncements.
Another point that comes to mind from all your comments is that, again, in the moderate world of the Islamic population, are there some individuals that in the moderate world that would emerge as great leaders to combat this, but there may be a caution because of the violence of the extremists that they could be assassinated?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it would take the courageous individuals to do that, because they would be out on the forefront, they will be targeted. But there are a lot of people, believing in their ideals, believing in what's right, and that's really what we need. But the risk, of course, is going to be there.
Certainly a good example of that was President Sadat of Egypt, when he had the courage to make agreements with Israel to try to bring peace, and he lost his life because of that.
Exactly, and anytime you hear about peace processes and negotiations, the extremists want to disrupt it. They want to cause some kind of a violent reaction from whatever side it may be, because it's not in their benefit to have the process proceed. Or if it's a improvement of relations between two countries, as what Sadat did. So basically, it's not in the best interest of the terrorists to see these kind of leaders make those courageous decisions.
You've written a book on this, and it's highly acclaimed in this country, and it's called The Terrorist Trap, America's Experience with Terrorism. And I would advocate it to our viewers. But based on that and all the research you've done and the touring of the country, are you optimistic about the future of how we combat terrorism?
Yes, I am, if we kind of get a feel for what our expectations should be. It really comes down to an issue of expectations. If we're expecting to prevent every single terrorist act, no, I'm not optimistic, because we can't do it. If we're expecting to arrest every terrorist, no. The most significant, maybe we can get some, not all. But in terms of trying to educate the public and even those in government and politicians to take everything in perspective and avoid the overreaction, be vigilant in terms of the battle against terrorism, but that understand that unfortunately we will have incidents, but you can still be optimistic in terms of what may lay ahead.
Well, Dr. Jeffrey Simon, it's been a pleasure having you in this conversation.
Well, thank you very much.
Good luck in your work.
Thank you.
I hope you have found this documentary most informative. The documentary featured two individuals that are highly acclaimed in the field of dealing with the threat of domestic and international terrorism, Dr. Jeffrey Simon and Colonel Philip P.J. Crawley. I hope you will join us for our fifth and last one-hour documentary at a later date. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching our fourth documentary titled The Threat of Domestic and International Terrorism. And as you know, you just a few minutes ago heard comments by Dr. Jeffrey Simon, who has a PhD in political science and wrote a very highly acclaimed book, The Terrorist Trap, America's Experience with Terrorism. You also heard on this documentary segments from an address by Colonel Philip J. Crawley, who is a fellow and director of Homeland Security at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C., and he used to be Assistant Deputy of Defense or Secretary of Defense dealing with certain aspects within that very important department, and also he was an advisor to President Clinton on the issue of terrorism. And you also heard from a special agent from the FBI. This is a very, very serious topic, and how do we identify terrorists, how do we combat terrorism, and then, of course, how do we get inside the minds of terrorists and their recruiting process. And so we now welcome you to our fourth town hall meeting of this series, and we have back with us a wonderful group of very diverse citizens in our region, and we're going to ask them a series of questions. But I will start with our student, and she'll introduce herself in a moment. Amanda will. She is a student at Untitled College, and her class did graphic designs for this series, and one of the two she chose was a design on dealing with terrorism. And her faculty member is here, and he too is to be thanked, Philippe, for having your class do this. So Amanda, tell us why you chose this topic and describe how your design sent a message.
Well, this is a global issues project, so I didn't want to focus on just September 11th. It's very disturbing behavior. I don't quite understand what's going on. But when we moved up here in 2002, my little boy was 5 years old. He was frisked at the airport. And I think that's one of the reasons I decided to do the illustration for global terrorism.
Describe what it looked like when you finished that. And we've had it on this documentary series, but and the viewers have seen it, but describe it to them.
I have the planet surrounded in flames. So it's
the planet inflames the threat of terrorism.
Global terrorism, not
Thank
just
you.
September 11th.
Thank you. Now we'll open it up to all those at the town hall meeting. How would you respond to not only 9/11, which really was a shock for us in the world, but today, as we sat here in 2008, what do you see the level of both internally, they're domestic terrorists. We saw that with what happened in Oklahoma City at the federal building, and we certainly saw what happened at 9/11 when we talk about Al-Qaeda and other terrorist cells. So from your viewpoint and vantage point, how would you describe terrorism today?
I'm Kay Nelson. I'm a retired faculty member from North Idaho College. In my opinion, I think that terrorism occurs for maybe three major reasons. Reason number one, religious, which may be the worst of all. Second, political. And the third, just flat out greed. So I think that what we're seeing in today's terrorism, I've got a feeling that religion is playing a major, major part here. How do we combat that? We have three major religions basically within our world, which is Christian, Judeo, as well as Muslim. Something rather interesting, when my son Eric was about a couple of years ago stationed in Iraq and got to be very, very acquainted with several Iraqi people who they learned to trust. And this question came up: how in the wide world can people live with in peace with one another? And this Iraqi people would come right out and tell them, okay, all three major religions have a beginning point with Abraham. And if we could perhaps maybe in our mind's eye go back and everybody recognize that, then maybe we can find some way of understanding and appreciating each person's differences. And if we can appreciate and understand that, then maybe we can push away the political part of it. I don't know how. There's no suggestion there for just flat-out greed, because some people want to make a lot of money and they're willing to do virtually anything. So I'll turn this over.
Not only money, but also get power.
To get power, yeah. Yes.
But that probably is, would you say that's the smallest number that's in that category, that the majority would be either in political movements or religious movements?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure really how to answer that. So I'm going to be interested to see if some of the other panel members might have some, give us some light on that.
Well, thank you, Kay. Who else?
Bob Bennett, Executive Director of the Human Rights Education Center and former president of NIC. I remembered.
You remember to do that? Okay.
There you go. I have mixed emotions about this whole question of terrorism. I don't think we should ever be naive and believe that all people are good and that they all want what's best for each of us. But I do think that there is some goodness in humanity, no matter what religion, no matter where they live, whatever else. But because we do things to each other, there we have to pay the consequences. I don't think there's ever been a time in the history of the United States where diplomacy is more important. We must understand those people in other places and understand why they are different, and maybe accept the fact that we are not right all of the time. People do things, bad things to us. I understand that, and they do it for the wrong reasons probably, but we have to understand what we do to other people as well, and I think we pay consequences. So on one hand, I don't want to be naive about terrorism. On the other hand, I don't want that to be the driving force about everything that we do, because we can get ourselves in a spot of saying, those people are bad people. And we don't understand why they're bad, and it may be in part because of things that we have done to them. So this becomes a human rights issue in a much larger perspective, and I am suspicious of when I hear our government say, well, we simply do not want to talk to them until certain conditions are met. I think maybe we need to start talking right up front with these people in an open and an honest way and not have to have all these preconceived conditions. So I come back to diplomacy. I am convinced that we've always had terrorism in the history of this world, but we need to rethink our relationships with each other and recognize that we're not always right.
Lauren?
I'm Lauren Burke. I'm a retired banker. I think one of the things to embellish on what Bob said is that we need to know we cannot change the whole world. The Muslims are not going to become Christians just because we want them to be. They're not going to become democracies simply because we're a democracy. We're talking about since Abraham, for heaven's sake. These people have been this way. And it's going to take us many centuries to change them, and I think what Bob just said is we need to talk first and then try to change the conditions that we want to have them try to meet, and maybe we need to change too.
Who next wants to speak to this issue? Jeff?
Hi again, Jeff Jeske, small-time entrepreneur, part-time thinker, part-time writer. Yes, absolutely. I think I'll agree with the panelists here that the first thing is understanding other people's religions. And yes, anybody that's been through high school or Sunday school ought to be able to know, should. And maybe that's part of our problem, is in the Judeo-Christian world I grew up in. We weren't really taught that there are other religions out there that base their beginnings on Father Abraham. That's certainly a driving force that I see in a terrorist, is their religious belief that we must do this way because it says so. Secondly, wow. People, again, back to this knowledge, paying attention, watching your news, reading the news from many sources. Perhaps I'm a little younger than some of these panel members, and my memory's a little better, but I do recall John McCain talking in an interview in the mid-'90s to an interviewer talking about just that 9/11 scenario coming down. And I also recall him saying, this terrorist, the number one terrorist in the world, we know his name now, Osama bin Laden, he needs to be taken out because something bad's going to happen. I personally was not surprised at the methods that were used to wake this country up, how shocking and abhorrent it was. But like I say, I really wasn't surprised, and I thought, well, gosh, people, haven't you been paying attention? This sort of stuff has been out there brooding about for some years. And as far as a positive way to change, yes, of course. First, the diplomacy. Second is a word I've heard a lot, tolerance. That one, that's an equal opportunity employer, which really has to go on both sides. Yet, perhaps they always say there has to be an adult in the children's squabble, and maybe that's where the United States of America is considered, metaphorically, if not else, otherwise, the child in the so-called civilized world. We need to make that first step in order to get that tolerance for our different beliefs. Because people, if you think that 9/11 thing was bad, look around and think of all the opportunities any single person terrorist could do to hurt and maim and kill lots of people in this country. Doesn't take much to get to our power plants, doesn't take even less to get to our water source. We have the biological things out here. We know they've been little things pop up here and pop up there, and anthrax, of course, comes to mind. How are you going to protect yourself from something like that? We really, really can't. We've got to get back to the basic roots.
Okay. So far, I've heard some great ideas: civility, communication, diplomacy, and human rights. I think that's a great beginning to our discussion. Anybody else have things to add?
Well, I want to ask a question, and Tony
Let's introduce Janelle Burke here again, who's been on the panel for over 33 years and is an attorney. And Janelle, it's always a pleasure working with you.
Thank you, Tony. My comment or my question to the rest of the panel is, can we become too fearful? Can we become so fearful that we are paralyzed, or that we become so fearful that other people can control us, actually, basically, exercise power over us, simply because we're so fearful? What do the other people believe?
Well, let's let the pilot go first here. That's certainly right.
Well, she kind of beat me to it. I think that probably
And this is Ron Johnson.
Sorry, my name is Ron Johnson. I'm a retired airline pilot. I think that the fear of terrorism is as crippling or more crippling than the terrorism itself. And we seem to have, it's even come into our politics to an extent that it colors every political decision that's being made. I think what Bob said about we have to look to ourselves. Years ago, they bombed some airplanes in the desert. We didn't pay attention then. And they've done smaller things since then, culminating in 9/11. A terrible act. And we're going to have to pay attention. I wonder, we call it a war on terrorism. All right, when the peace comes, when the war ends, who signs the papers? I don't know who the war is against. It's against an idea, and it's very hard to have a war with an idea. So we're treating these on a case-by-case basis. At least we were when we were fighting the war against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But it seems to have widened from there to it's no longer a war against terrorism. It's a war where we can find war. And so I would like to see us take a more pointed view and really fight terrorism where we find it, and maybe try to look to ourselves to see if we can eliminate some of the things that might create this war.
Go ahead. Someone else have a comment on that? And Philippe, when you introduce yourself, Philippe also is from Europe, and you may have a different perspective of how Europeans look at this challenge.
I'm Philippe Val, a graphic design instructor at NIC. I see terrorism in a different light because I come from France, and we had in Italy the Red Brigade, Brigade Rouge, and we have PTA in Spain. So I see this in a different way, and I believe like a better understanding of the entire issue would be worth looking into it. I grew up with a lot of Muslim, Jewish, Lebanese friends. I went to school with all those people, and I understand their religion, and I believe they try to understand mine. And it was just growing up together, so at least I have an understanding. I do know that if you insult a Muslim person, they will remember that for their entire life. And maybe the not understanding that aspect, like Bob was mentioning earlier, understanding what we have done to them and why do they react that way, it probably be a good start. Terrorism is going to be here to stay. Unfortunately, it's been there for many years. In the United States, 9/11 was the alarm, I guess, where everybody reacted quickly. But I have a different opinion. I traveled extensively throughout the world. I traveled in 2001. I know there was a lot of inspections in the airport, and then now we have a lot of inspection as a result of what happened in 9/11. But I think we are reacting, and we didn't understand how to prevent in the past, and this is probably why we have now. So we have to deal with that big issue, which in Europe has been there for a long time. So not that I have more experience, I don't know what would be the solution, but understanding others probably will be better in the long run. And I think the communication with those people, I believe terrorists are a small amount of people. It's not a nation. So as we talked about Iraq or Afghanistan, it's probably only a few people. And those people are controlling the entire situation and obviously paralyze us on many ways. So I'm not sure what the solution is, but communication, understanding of the others, and why they're reacting that way, why are they doing such terrible things to a country or a group of people will be a great value. I'm not sure if people are ready to do that.
On our experts that, and Kay has comment, but they talked about some of these same issues, which I'll bring up, but we'll go to Kay Nelson first.
Often, or more often than not, I think we talk about terrorism as if it is a violent act against the other person that results in injury or death. I think that the discussion really should also go right into the other forms of terrorism, which can be, number one, a person decides that they're not even going to communicate in a fair and understanding way. This could be like domestic terrorism. Refusal to recognize that other person, maybe in your household, is a real person, and so there is just a lockout. I think that number two, that terrorism can easily and does take place in an economic sense. I think that a country can have so much economic power that they can basically freeze out another group of people so that they have no chance whatsoever to be able to then produce goods for themselves and to live in peace within their own culture.
I want to follow up on Janelle Burke's question you had, and we hit the surface, but this is really crucial. And I have a little background here. A very distinguished U.S. Senator said to me one time, he actually was chair of the Foreign Relations Committee of the U.S. Senate. And in those days, he and all the rest of us, we had great concern about communism in the Soviet Union and with nuclear weapons. And in a comment to me one day, he said, we have to combat that problem, but if we become so fearful of its strength and threat, we might give up almost all of our liberties, our civil liberties, to be secure, and then therefore they have won without firing a shot. I thought of that when 9/11 and then the things that happened since then. Again, we certainly have to have a government that has, in my view, a certain amount of power to keep us safe. But if we allow that government to have such power that we have no longer privacy or free speech, whatever it may be, then the great tragedy of that, is it not true, is that the terrorists have caused us to give up our liberties. How would you respond to that? I see Ron thinking very deeply on this.
Well, I couldn't agree more. That's what's happened. That's what I meant when I said it's entered our politics. It's used now, fear is used to espouse one candidate over another one. It's not new in this election. It's happened in several elections prior to now. But when we let the fear take over, we do give up. Was it Ben Franklin that said something about that? I can't remember his exact quote, but those who would give up liberty for security will end up achieving neither.
Or deserving neither.
Or deserving neither. That's paraphrased, but that's close to what he said. And I think that's kind of the situation we find ourselves in.
How would others react to that? Lauren?
I think that was touched on already, but economically, they really don't have to fire a shot. All they have to do is put out a tape about every 4 to 6 months, and we go into hyperventilation and spend billions of dollars that we can't even find this cave dweller. So it's really important that we not let ourselves be panicked into just going headlong like the lemmings over the end of the sea, I guess.
Bob Bennett.
You know, I think of the amount of money that we put into our military, and I used to teach a class in government, and I said, this was when we were in the Cold War, and I said, think for just a minute if you were a Russian, and you understood that we control almost every country surrounding Russia. How would you as a Russian feel about the United States? Well, obviously, we were fearful, or they were fearful of us, and they would react accordingly. When you think of the difference between the size of our military and the military of any other country in this world, we're bigger than all of them put together. It's easy to understand why they're afraid and why they are resistant and why they are reaching and doing ugly, mean things to people. But there's a reason for that. And I think our politicians have got to ask the question, why are they so upset with us? And then if we examine what we've done, even though we've done it for what we thought were very good reasons, it can be certainly thought about differently by other people looking at us. And that's why I come back to this diplomacy thing. I don't want to be naive. There are ugly people out there doing ugly things. We know that. But there's a much bigger picture that I think this government has got to look at, rather than say that terrorism is going to drive everything they do. I think on one hand, it could be a very positive thing when people are saying, we've looked at the United States and we know how they believe in human rights, and we know that the individual is important. Therefore, we're struggling to have those same rights. And even though they're maybe doing it inappropriately, they are in a sense saying that human rights question's out there again, and we want what you've got. But you can't have this great big military giant hovering over us saying, we know what's right for you, and expect us to like it.
Let's turn that on the other side of the coin. Thank you very much. The other side of the coin, and I think Bob was talking about this a minute ago, there's evil in the world.
There's always evil.
And Adolf Hitler was evil. And he wanted to eliminate a whole race of people. Actually, if he could have prevailed, it would not only have been the Jewish population, but there would have been others, the homosexual community, etc. He was a very evil person. And also, there are other evil people in the world. And one of the things that some experts have been talking about lately is that, and you refer to this, that the Western world, with its what we consider great advancements in culture, the arts, humanities, economically and all, that some of the individuals who are very angry at the West are very jealous that they don't have this, or their subconscious is that they are failing in many ways, and the way they compensate for their lack of advancement, is what we consider advancement, is to attack those that are having this kind of progress. How would you react to those comments, someone?
I would just take one more step and say that when we talk about terrorism and we say all these people from the Middle East or wherever are going to come and get us, and we talk about the haves and the have-nots, I've often said if we don't do something with respect to our inner core cities, the terrorism that we've experienced from someplace else is going to be minuscule compared to the kind of terrorism that we could experience in our own cities from our own citizens, unless we rethink how we treat each other.
These dialogues are so wonderful. Let me add one other thing, and then someone will respond to it. We say that poverty can cause, terrorism, but when you look at 9/11 and all the people involved in that, and Osama bin Laden, most all of them came from upper-class, wealthy families. So how do you deal with that? You've got the microphone, Janelle.
I wasn't going to speak to that, but I think perhaps sometimes people who have had privilege can use it in a very powerful way if they choose to do that, if they choose to use and history is replete with examples of people who have had plenty, starting with some of the saints, and who then became interested in what they could do for other people.
And you can go back to whatever you're going to deal with. I just brought that out, and you were going to talk about something else.
Well, I was going to echo what you said earlier about civil rights. And if we look at history again, for example, the Nazis, removal of civil rights was one of the things that allowed Hitler to exercise the power that he was capable of exercising later on. So we must always be vigilant about those civil rights. And oftentimes you hear people say, well, it doesn't really affect me because it's not important to me. I wasn't going to do that anyway. Well, that's not the point. The point is that the civil rights protect all of us. And so we need to have those civil rights and be vigilant about giving them up.
Let me just, we're about out of time, but also, aren't they people you cannot make agreements with or you cannot negotiate? Would you agree that Adolf Hitler could not be stopped by any way other than by war? Bob doesn't agree with it, so we have about 2 minutes. Bob, go ahead.
I think Hitler was an evil man that did ugly, ugly things. But again, I think if we had looked at the situation earlier, we could have stopped Adolf Hitler before he ever became that powerful. I'm not sure. We're so quick to say World War II is a justifiable war, but I think if we would really explore the ways that we could confine people through economic pressure, there are other ways to deal with those kinds of people than just killing others.
I have to stop on that note. Thank you at this town hall meeting. You've been very, very stimulating in your thoughts. And ladies and gentlemen, next week we're going to be with you for our final 5th documentary, and it has to do with genocide. And we'll, after we see those experts, we'll have a town hall meeting. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.